So I'm a full stack developer out there, mainly focused on the front end, just because we don't have a lot of front end developers. Great place to work. I also am a Code Louisville mentor, so coming up on this will be my third session teaching that. So that's a lot of fun. I know you went through Code Louisville, some other people. It's fun stuff. So tonight I'm going to be talking about component libraries. How this got started is about 4 months ago at Generation Tux. We have a problem where basically we actually are called Generation Tux. We do online suit tuxedo rentals, but we actually have a brand we acquired called Mingwin. And it's basically the exact same as Generation Tux, but styled slightly differently because we have been told to keep both brands alive. So we've got this problem of duplicate everything. And we were like, how can we simplify this on the front end? And we came to a component library would probably really help us out with this. We were also thinking we're using Bootstrap 3, some older front end technologies with React, and we're like, how can we just bring all this into React and simplify a lot of things? So this is React specific, but you can apply component libraries in Angular, Vue, whatever other hot new framework comes out. So it's a pretty common thing. So I kind of already talked a bit about why use a component library. But one big thing is you can work with a lot of confidence once you get started in your component library. And it's just awesome. It's a lot of fun. It's better. It's pretty easy. But I think to explain why, I want to take a step back and kind of look at what we've called, or how we've worked previously. So everybody knows you've got CSS here on the left, HTML, and then JavaScript there on the right. And these have classically been called like our separation of concerns. Normally it's like, let's get our separation of concerns together. Especially if you've been doing this for a while. That used to be a big thing 4 or 5 years ago. You'd see it all over Twitter. But in my opinion, these are kind of like tech concerns. So we'll come back to that. So for a couple years, replace React with Angular, Vue, whatever you're using, maybe even jQuery to inject HTML into the DOM. We've kind of lumped these together. So we've kind of ended up with CSS, our styling, whatever we're using there, Sass, less, and then we've ended up with our JavaScript and HTML combined together. And there definitely was a lot of drama getting to this point. If you were on Twitter, you would have the vanilla, pure JavaScript people who are saying, we don't want to build websites like this. This is terrible. It's a bad idea. And then people saying, hey, this is a good idea. And I think we've kind of ended up on the point of view where it's like, it's probably a good thing. So somehow we still got here. Because most people now are using React or Angular. And really enjoying it and finding that they can work fast, get a lot of stuff done, all of that some fun stuff. So we come back here, and so we're looking at these, and like 4 years ago, these would be our separation of concerns. But like CSS isn't really like a concern. Like if I went up to my stakeholder at work and they were like, make this, and I was like, here's my CSS, or if in stand-up I say to my stakeholder, I worked on CSS yesterday, they're going to be like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't care. Like, CSS is really not their concern. They would rather hear, I worked on this button for a video player, or like, redesigned this. They want to know more of what you got done, what it looks like, what its functionality is, less of the tech behind it. So like, I've been kind of thinking of these as like academic concerns, technical concerns. At a root level, they are our concerns, but not really. So I saw a tweet a couple years ago, and this was when I was still on the fence between like I don't want to be mixing my concerns. I don't want my JavaScript or my HTML inside my JavaScript or whatever. And I saw this tweet that had this image. So it's like separation of concerns from one point of view, CSS, JavaScript, HTML. Separation of concerns only from a different point of view is it's your button, your date picker, your modal, your list item, your media. And it's like, these are now your concerns. Your concern is your button. What you make with your button is not necessarily a concern. So it's kind of a way of looking at it that's slightly different. So we come back to this. So we've got our CSS and React on the right. So these are kind of two things that are still separate, and we're having to intermingle, mix them together, all that fun stuff. But if we did something like this, which this is still not quite right. So we've got React, and we're saying, what if we bundled in our CSS, JavaScript, and HTML all together, brought all of our concerns under one thing? But what I have with like a diagram like this is that it's like React is still not our concern, in my opinion, because I want my concerns to be as close to the stakeholders' concerns as possible. I don't want like, I know that technically like I am programming in React, but it doesn't really matter what I'm programming in. It matters what I'm getting done. So like you could jump on at a company that's using really old technology or has something old, and that's still fine as long as you're still getting good work done that your stakeholders want you to get done. So I kind of like to view it more like this. You've got your button, your header, your column, your row, same thing as that one diagram we saw. And then on the right, it's like, here's what we use to build this. But like, these are our main concerns. And that's kind of my pitch for like, I know going back in time 2 years, why it's all right to like bundle your CSS, JavaScript, HTML all together and have it all intertwined in JavaScript. And I don't know if there's anyone in this room who needs convincing of that, but it's just kind of like my opinion on it. But it's very important for using a component library because you're bundling all of those things together. So you may not necessarily be a fan of component libraries if you're having to bundle these things together and you don't like it. So a couple problems you can solve with a component library. And we'll get to an example in a few minutes. The where is my code problem. So at Generation Tux, we're using, well, we're transitioning to a component library. We'll explain in a minute, but we're using, on some of our marketing sites, Bootstrap, HTML, all of that. But the Bootstrap theme also has a lot of customization that lives in a different location than the Bootstrap theme. So sometimes you'll use a CSS class and you have no idea where it's at. Is it in this npm package way over here? Is it in a local file? How is it compiled? Like, what's going on? Where does this class come from? And I've got a little illustration here for that, is that you've got your CSS, HTML, and JavaScript. And you've got all of the orange lines are what makes up your button. And all of the gray lines are the extra code. And our little wizard friend here basically has to take all of the code related to our button and bring it together. So when you're thinking about, like, I want to modify this button, I know it's a trivial example, you have to think, well, where's my CSS, JavaScript, and HTML for this button? And HTML is less of a concern there, I think, for sure. But you're having to think, like, where is all this located? If I modify this, what's going on? But instead, if you bring all of those into a button, you're only left with the code that is related to your button. So when you sit down and you say, I want to modify my button, you can modify just the button code, and you know that everything that builds your button lives right there with the button. And I've kind of been hinting on it too. It also stops cross-contamination. So especially you'll find this problem really apparent in CSS, or at least for myself. Just this past week, we had somebody push a bug that basically modified just a couple lines of CSS, changed some classes. But that ended up, because we're using Sass, different things were inheriting off of each other, causing several bugs that ended up out in production. Well, if it was a component library, he can modify just that code and then say, I know the only thing that this affects is my button. And I can test that button thoroughly and make sure that everything is still the exact same, or it's what I expect it to be, and not have to go through and test our site, our entire flow and everything to make sure nothing got broken. That's not true with all components. If you build a component that's a column and row system and you modify that column and row system, it might be best to still test everything. Also provides a feedback loop. So with Bootstrap, one thing that we're all full stack developers in Generation Tux, but we have specialties because it's not possible to be amazing at everything, at least in my opinion. So we have specialties. So a lot of times our backend guys will need to write some front end code. There's just no way around it. They need to do it. Well, if they're using Bootstrap, sometimes they'll forget to put a row around the columns, or there's a container class, and you can't nest those things. But they don't get any feedback on that. They just do it, and it looks kind of all right, but they're not realizing that it's 16 pixels off on each side, or they have nested containers causing bugs on mobile. There's no feedback besides their eyes. And sometimes if they're in a hurry, they'll miss those things, especially when they're small. Just 16 pixels on each side is now messed up. But for a user, when they're going through your site, small things like that can make a big difference between is this professional or not. With a component library, though, you've got JavaScript with your HTML and CSS. You can check to see, is there a row wrapping this column? Is there a column inside my row? Is there something inside my row there shouldn't be? You can provide feedback for developers who are not necessarily front-end developers, or who aren't even specializing in, basically specializing in front-end web development. It can also be helpful for us too, because I've nested containers. Like I'll have React components in like three components in, there's another container. And it's like, whoops, I accidentally nested a container, kind of hard to tell. But with React components, you can basically build logic, or any components. You can build logic, checks what's inside of it, make sure it's valid, all of that. So some people would kind of say, is it like kind of overcomplicated to like, let's set React up, set Webpack up to build all these components and then ship those to NPM, install them and everything. And they would say, is that overcomplicated? And I would say it's not necessarily overcomplicated, it's just maybe different. So we do the same thing with Bootstrap and Sass. We install Gulp to build Sass or Less or whatever, and then ship that up to NPM and install it. Like we've been doing that with CSS, and I would argue this is less complicated because we're bringing everything together in one location. Because you'd be surprised, with a fairly simple component library of like under 20 components, you could build almost your entire website, which is really cool. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily like overcomplicating things. It may just be different. And depending on your specific scenario, it definitely could be overcomplicating things, because there's no like magic bullet in web development. Like this is a good solution for some people, a terrible solution for others. But in our situation, it definitely was not overcomplicating. It definitely reduced complexity, which is awesome. And I've written down that like if you're doing one-off client websites for like an agency or something, component libraries are definitely going to be a bit overkill. Like, are you going to make a component library to build small marketing websites every time you need to make one? Probably not. So we'll get to some examples finally. I didn't know how long it would take me to get here, so on paper it looked like it would take longer, but that's all right. So I'm just going to throw up a couple of slide examples, and then we're going to sit down and actually build an example. I'm going to live code to the best of my ability. So pulling from our site, this is, if you've used Bootstrap before, I know this might be pretty small. There's actually a bug in here that I wrote, but on accident that I noticed this morning. This is kind of like what something would look like previously for us. You'd have a row, then a column, and a column, and you would be column extra small 12. The second one should say column medium 6, and you're basically building your column system with 2 buttons inside of it. It's not pretty hard to read, but it's not apparent, because the first thing you see is div, and then you've got to find your class, and your class tells you what this is, instead of being able to look at something and say, this is exactly what this is, which is kind of what a component library gives you. So this is a React example, but you see the first thing, you see row, column, button. So like a non-front-end developer can look at this and go, oh my gosh, it's a row and column system. They can glance at it very easily. We found it very easy to read for us at Generation Tux. I know this is a bit React specific, how components work, but it's been pretty awesome. And we can also do validation. So back here, we can't say, hey, you entered a column that's 13 instead of 12, and we only do a 12-column grid. Here, we can check that number and say, like, hey, your number's out of bounds. It's 13 instead of 12. Or you can even say, like, hey, we noticed you had 2 columns that added up to 40 instead of 12 tops, which is a lot of fun. But yeah, so we'll do a little live example. Does anybody have any questions so far? Okay, I can slow down. So let me. Okay, so I've got a little bit of a test project set up here, and the technologies that this is going to be using. Show this off to the side. Is we're using something called Storybook, which came out not too long ago, but it's awesome. And it basically lets you build and test your component library, and then export a static site that's basically documentation for your component library all in one. And it makes it really easy to work on your component library, really easy to self-document the component library, and get your team on board. So Storybook is awesome. And then clearly I pitched to you the whole time is that CSS and JavaScript is half of my pitch here. So we're using something called Styled-Components. So if you've used React, how many people here have used React before? Okay, so in React specifically, I can't speak to the others. You can inject styles into an element by doing style, double curly brackets, and you've got basically like the object style syntax. Styled components basically lets us write CSS, and it gives us some of the nice features of Sass and Less and all of that, along with some great tools to go around it. So it's an awesome way to write CSS, and then we'll append class names to your HTML that's rendered and attach CSS to things. It's an awesome way to write CSS inside of JavaScript. So I'm really a big fan of it. So over here, I don't know if you can see it. I can make it bigger probably. So on the right hand side, just some basic folder structure is you've got Storybook at the top, and this is all in a Git repo I'll share at the end too. You've got Storybook, and that's basically our configuration for Storybook. They've got Storybook for React, Angular, Vue. You can, I think, even just use Storybook with no framework at all. So it's an awesome tool that anybody can use. And then our ignored build directory, our configuration directory. So Storybook is not like, it's not going to build your component library for you to use. So I've got some Webpack build files in there. You can see how I'm building it. It's a pretty simple use case to build that. Then we've got our source folder, which has all of our components and our theme inside of it. And then you've got, let's get this out of the way. Storybook static, which is your static hosted site once it's built. And then all of the other config JavaScript garbage at the bottom. So we'll jump into source. So what we're going to build, I've been talking a lot about a button. So we're going to build, let's minimize all that, a button. So we've got our component and theme folder here. Themes is fairly simple. All we're doing here is we've got variables that are basically like, here's our primary color, gray, white, black, red, green, shadow. These are going to be important later because these are things that we're going to share across our components. This is super valuable for us because we have 2 brands. So our components at Gen Tux will automatically detect whether they're on Gen Tux or Mingwen and pull in a different theme. But luckily, we don't have to do that tonight. So if we open up our component, I've already created some of the like scaffolding here just to get us started. We've got our button down in here. So how I've set these up is there's button story. So this is basically like the story that describes our button, which is really cool. And then our style for our button. So even though like I say like you've got your separation of concerns, it doesn't mean you have to shove everything in one file. Like you can absolutely leave your style separate. We don't want 4,000 line long files. So I always like to separate out my style, but when I come looking for my button, I know everything is here, including the story for my button. So we're going to work backwards, and we're actually going to write our story first, and this will basically be what displays our button. So what I'm actually going to do is come over here to my terminal, and then just npm start. We'll make sure that's up and running. So this has got Storybook running. And if we come over here to, so Storybook is awesome because let me show you. So here's what our Storybook at work looks like. So you can basically see on the right. I should make this bigger. You've got your like welcome layout, all of that, but I can jump in here and say, here are our components. We've got buttons. You can look at an overview of the button, the different types of buttons we have, sizing, spacing, scroll through here. You can come over here and set your viewport. It's a lot of fun. And then we've got our layout components like box, column, row, all of that. It's a lot of fun to work with Storybook. Wanted to show you this so you can see what it looks like when you've got more components inside of Storybook. Because right now all we're going to have is our lonely button over here. And when I look at types, let me make it bigger. It basically just says our button is going to go here. So we're going to come over here and go to our button story. Make that go away. So I've already got a bit of scaffolding here. I'm basically importing everything that Storybook needs. I'm going ahead and importing our button from the current directory. And then this is just button types info. And this is basically just a small description we'll see of our button. So if we come to Firefox and hit show info over here, it shows us that description right here. And then it shows us the source. So if a developer is coming through and like, I want to use that button, they can come over here and just copy the source and start using it. They can see like self-documented how it's going to work. And that source is actually, you see div, button goes here. That's this guy right here. So we're going to build a list of buttons that supports different types, button styles. So we're going to support a default, an info, a primary, and a danger button. So I'm going to make a list for this. And we're just writing plain old JSX React in here, which is fun stuff. So we're going to do a button, and say default, and I'm going to come over here and write button type equals default. Okay, I'm just going to grab this guy a bunch, or 4 times. Oh gosh, if anyone else has had Prettier do this, you know it's the bane of your existence. So, and then what are our other types? Info, primary, danger. Probably could have done this a better way. So, what I'm doing here is basically just writing, what did I mess up? There we go. There was no error. It's just Prettier. So what we're basically doing here is writing. Sorry, the screen over here has got a different area. What we want our button to do and support first. So if we come back to Storybook, we'll see it's auto refreshed. It should have. I will be. Oh, there's a reason for that. It's because our button component that we're using is just returning I will become a button. So these are the 4 different kind of buttons we're going to support. So if we come back over here to our button now, this is just an old React component, and if everybody can see this pretty well, it's a functional component. There's no state needed for this, and it basically is saying I am going to become a button. So we're going to make it a button, but to do that, I've got to import the styled button from button.style. And this will make sense working backwards. Use a styled button, and we're going to give it our children that we're importing right here, and we're going to inject our props into that button. So that'll basically pass through all of our props and render any children we give the button inside that button. And this is our children in this case. It's just this text, default, info, primary, danger. So that's all this really needs to do. So if we come back over to Firefox, we should see a bunch of buttons now. Default, info, primary, and danger, but they're not styled. So we can use this button component all we want, but it's not styled at all. So we're going to go, figure out how to open the side, style. So this is kind of where a lot of the fun happens with styled components in Storybook. Is this file is where we're going to write our styling for those buttons. This styled button that I'm importing, you can see I import styled components at the top. And then I say styled.button. That tells it this is going to be a button element in HTML. And then right here, we can start writing our CSS, and it will apply to this button. But we've got access to all of the same props here. So we have access to them. So first we can just say background color is red. And I think if I switch my theme here, you can install a plugin that basically detects and will style this area just like CSS. That way you're not just feeling like you're writing CSS in text. So background color is red. We come to our buttons. Did I actually save that? Oh, don't need to actually put quotes around it. So you see this Storybook auto updates, does all that. Our background color is red. And we've got access to our props. So, well, I'll show you that in a second. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to construct, this is a way we like to build a lot of our components that have options like this, something called button styles. And this will be an object, and our types are default, I don't need this, default, info, primary, and then danger. So what this lets us do is basically separate our custom styling for each of those buttons out. And I know this is going to be different because we're writing CSS in here, but it's interesting because we're in a JavaScript ecosystem, you can organize your CSS in a much different way than before, which is a lot of fun. And then what we'll do down here is, you can see these right here. These let us do template literals. So we can come over and basically say, pass this a function, so props. And if we pass it a function, it will inject props for our component into that function. If we don't pass it a function, it just lets us write any JavaScript we want. And that's a storybook specific, not storybook, style component specific feature, which is really awesome. Let me know if it's too far down. So we're going to say right here, we're going to say prompts, and then we're going to say button styles props dot button type. So you can see here in our button story, we've been passing it button type. And what we're going to do is we're going to inject the styling from default info, primary, danger, whatever type it is, into our styled button. So there's no styling up there yet, but if we were to come to this one and just say background color equals red, you'll see it'll just make this one red. So now we've got access to style these different components. But first we want to do a bit of global styling. So we're going to do, what are we going to do? Actually, yeah, so we'll set some padding. Make sure it's not too much, I think that's all we need to do there for the moment. So we're going to come up here to, yeah, there is actually one thing. We want to get rid of that border. Border is none. So we're just going to get rid of the border. We're just writing plain old CSS for now. We're going to come up to each of these guys. Just multiple cursor inserts. We're going to do background color. And then what we're going to do here is we're actually going to import all of those variables we had. So import variables from, gotta go way up, theme variables. And this is just an object of those variables that we can reference across our theme. Styled Components has a great way where if you have multiple brands, you can wrap things in a theme component, and it will basically interpret which brand you're using and pull in a different theme for those things. Much how you would have like a separate Bootstrap theme. So we're going to come here to this first one, and for all of these, we're going to write, we want to write a bit of JavaScript inside of a template literal. And if you notice, these are all marked CSS. That's Styled Components' way of saying, I don't want a button, so I don't want a styled.button. I just want some CSS. And we can come here and we're going to say variables. And for this first one, the default one is going to be gray. For the info, we'll do green. For the primary, there's a primary button color, and then danger will do red. So if we were to come to these guys, you see now we're default info, primary, danger. These are our buttons. We're going to add a cursor, pointer. So you can see Storybook is awesome. It live updates everything. So next thing, we're just going to add a bit of animation. All these buttons, or not animation. Border bottom, 6 pixels solid. That color. And you notice everything should stay the same. And then here's where Storybook gets interesting: is we can come down here and say, do stuff that you would do in SAS, LS, all of that. We can say ampersand, hover, and we can say the background color is now white, and the box shadow is now, we have a variable for that, variables dot shadow. So now we come and we've got a bit of button styling transition to that, which is fun to be able to write hover in here. Clearly you have to have that because you can't reference by class name. But they've got a lot of other cool stuff for animations, media queries, all of that is built in and supported, which is a ton of fun. And then we're just going to add transition, 100 milliseconds. So we built some pretty simple buttons. So can change things, live updates really easily. If we inspect, what you can see is going on inside of these buttons is that they're adding class names to those buttons. And that's how things are getting injected onto those buttons, which is really cool to see. It's not just inline styling things. Yeah, so you can see everything that's going on here. It's really easy. It doesn't really mutilate it too much. And then you can use the React Dev tools if you need to. So another cool thing is we can say we want this guy down here to be disabled. So we'll pass disabled to that. Go away. So you can see we've kind of accepted like the default button disabled, but we want a style for that. So we'll come back here, and actually I want to add color as white, and then the color here is black. There we go. So we can come back here and say, what do we want it to look like if it's disabled? Well, we know the first thing is we don't want it to have a hover state if it's disabled. Actually, we'll make that the second thing. So we can come down here and just hit disabled, and we can say the opacity is 0.5. Great way to show things are disabled. So it's 0.5, but now it still has its hover state. So normally you would add something that overrides all those hovers in CSS. If you're using JavaScript, you can approach it from a different way. So you can say props, and you can say if it's not disabled, you can oh yeah, you got to give it a bit of you got to do the CSS. It gets me sometimes. So we can pass that up through there. Let's move that up. Ooh. Sorry, typing and not looking directly at my screen is much harder than I expected. So you can see now our button has no disabled state, or has no hover state when it's disabled. You can do a lot of other things. Cursor equals no, is it not allowed? Just add a bit more to it, which is pretty easy. One thing that we didn't do is we didn't really come in here and say define our prop type. So this is where we can start to limit, and like if you're using TypeScript, you can use TypeScript in here too, and maybe even get a better result than just using button.prop types. But you can basically say this accepts button type, which is a prop types.string, and then the default for that is default. So now if I need to, I can pull this off. And then it still has its default styling. And then one thing is we'll definitely need an on-click. So we'll just say prop types dot, it's a function, and then disabled is prop types dot bool. So if somebody comes in here and tries to pass a string to disabled, they're going to get an error. And we want to say disabled is false by default. The cool thing is being able to set defaults too. So I can say true, and now everything goes to default, for example, or goes to disabled. You wouldn't do that with disabled. You want the default to be false, but there's some good use cases for that, I think. So it's pretty easy to go through here. I think where the coolest features are is it's great to develop here because I don't have to worry about the rest of my environment. Like if you've ever linked npm packages, you know that like waiting for that to compile and then waiting for the other one to compile can take a minute, and then linking is difficult. So it's nice to be able to just pull this up and work directly in here in components. It's not always possible to do every component in here, but it's nice for a lot of them. The cool thing is you come to this as a non-front-end developer, and you can see a couple things. We can add notes down here if we want, or you can hit show info up here, and it'll have our little description, but it also shows us the source. So I can come in here and look and say, like, I want that primary button, and just copy this out of here. And if you come down here, it actually documents all of the prop types you put on that button. So I know this button accepts a button type of string, disabled is a bool, on-click is a function, and you can set a description. Prop types aren't the greatest thing ever, so we can't say this string is limited to info, primary, default, stuff like that. If you're using TypeScript and had some type files in here, you could do that. We use TypeScript on some stuff, not everything. I don't necessarily love it in React, but that's a different discussion. But you can see all of the documentation for everything here, which is a lot of fun. The last thing we want to do is you can sometimes want to test functionality of things. So for buttons in Storybook, it's very easy. So we can come to this button and pass on click, and then what we can do is I've imported action up here. Storybooks has a ton of add-ons. You can see action. An action is just one of them. You can see most of the things you're actually seeing in Storybook, like the add-on info, which is this right here, is actually a plugin for Storybook. There's tons. So we can say I want an action, and all I want it to do is just, for this time, I just want it to print back default button clicked. And then if I click that button, you can see the action is logged down here. But you can do a lot more complicated things that basically lets you test, is the functionality of this button working? And you can use the action logger instead of having to pull up the console, look over at the console, and see like what's going on, which is a lot of fun. So that's a general overview of Storybook. And then when you're done with it, it builds super easy. And if you were to use something at work, we just use Netlify. So we just point it at our Git repo and say, here's the documentation for it. If anybody comes through, we just say, like, here's our documentation for our component library. And you can see that. So we've got a lot of stuff like layout. So it gets more complicated than buttons. But we've got box. And we stole box, the idea from it, from Pinterest, if you've seen their component library. And this basically is like our do-all component. But then like column. So they can come over here and see how columns work, which is a lot of fun. They can see how rows work. And then what's fun about columns is you can come back to this column. In viewport, I can come down here and say I just want to see things on an iPhone 5. And you can see how they change without having to pull up your dev tools, all of that. It's just nice convenience features for documenting. You can also search, which is a lot of fun. Trying to think of anything else. There's not much to it. Storybook is fairly simple. And it's great even if you're not using style components. You can use whatever you want to style it. You can use a Bootstrap theme to style your stuff still. But Storybook is great for just documenting components. At least in our opinion. We've had a ton of luck with it. I know it's gained a ton of popularity recently. And it's nice. It lets you basically write your component examples and self-documents them for you. Which is a lot of fun. Trying to think if there's anything else in here. That's Storybook. Does anybody have any questions about Storybook, style components, anything like that? If not, I'll jump back in. I've got a few more slides. Okay. I know that's quick. I'm going fast. So that's a live example. So a problem that we had at Generation Tux with component libraries is basically it's like there's no way they are going to let us implement that. Because if you approach it from the perspective of, and this is what we tried to do at first, is saying, we want to totally strip everything out from our Bootstrap theme, rewrite everything in components, all of that, and we go, it's going to take this amount of time. And then they go, absolutely not. No way you can have 2 months to do that. That's not going to happen. So we've taken a different approach of basically doing it in parts and increments. So we're actually still sitting in a weird state right now, where half of our stuff is componentized, a lot of our new stuff, and then a lot of our stuff is still Bootstrap theme. But because what we're doing is we're saying, if I get a story that's basically, we want you to redesign this page. I won't redesign the page with Bootstrap, I'll do it with a component library. Or if they say, we want you to go update the text on this small component or page, I'll jump in and say, instead of saying that'll take 30 minutes, I'll say that'll take an hour and a half to do. What I'm doing instead with that extra time is rewriting it in the component library. Because especially, we're kind of lucky where we work. Our stakeholders don't ask us how long something is going to take. We've set up kind of the culture of that. They basically just say, we want this done, and we're like, we'll put it in our queue and we'll get it done. So that gives us a bit of freedom to slow down and rebuild things step by step. Which has also allowed us to kind of iterate on the component library instead of just saying, here's our component library, we're wizards, we know exactly what the end result of this needs to be, and now we're going to implement it. We can say, hey, we are missing that feature from the component library in this use case. We'll step back and build it. It lets us build it in small steps. So we've been referring to it as the Trojan horse method. We're still delivering things, but we're shipping small things inside of it. So, silly little illustration. You've got your components, this is your deliverable. Your stakeholders are like, oh, we got our deliverable, they got it fast, it works great, but we're basically increasing the developer friendliness of the code by taking our time and slowing down a tiny bit. I know that's not realistic for everybody because at a lot of places it's like, how long is this going to take? We want it now, and there's not even time to step back for 30 minutes. I know it's how it is some places, and there's no avoiding it. And then my last slide is, real quick, this goes back to the a lot of times stakeholders, they don't like care how your button is implemented. They just care that they get their button. So this is another example of like why I've been trying to take my separations of concerns from technical things. Even though I'm a technical person, I've been trying to move my separation of concerns closer to what the stakeholders want. Because I can be like a tech whiz, and I'm not at all, but I could be the techiest whiz there is, but like the stakeholders don't care if I spend my time like twiddling my fingers with CSS and JavaScript and HTML and not getting their stuff done. So I've been trying to like realign my point of view to be closer to stakeholders, and I think this is part of that. It's like they don't always care what it's done in, they just care that it gets done. But that depends on where you work. Your stakeholder could be a technical person, and they do absolutely care like how it's gotten done. So I've talked a lot about the component library at Generation Tux. It's got a lot of use for us because we've got 2 brands. That's where it's been a big deal for us, is we basically use, what are they called? We use the new context API in React, and it basically lets us wrap our entire project on our this new basically app we're building. It's a single page app. It lets us wrap the entire thing with a component called theme. And we basically set the brands at Gen Tux or Mingling. And all of the components will then load in a different variables file for what brand it is, depending on which one you specified. So we can have totally different looks on both of our brands, which is what our stakeholders want, while only having to write code once and just modifying some variables. You can absolutely do that in Sass, Bootstrap, all of that. It's not something that's like, oh, it's new and mystical, you can only do it in component libraries. We just think it's like an easier way to do it for our situation. We're really lucky that our stakeholders don't really care what technology we're using, and they don't ask us how long it's going to take. That's given us a lot of leeway to work on this, but in reality, it really hasn't taken that long. So we'll say, we need this new component. It won't take that long to write the component, ship it, and in the end, it'll save time next time we go to change something. But I know that at some companies, and even our company, saving time later is not always a good selling point. So yeah, and then the component library has just kind of brought our front-end team like closer to the stakeholders' point of view, which is important for us because we're the ones that the stakeholders work with the most, because we're the team that handles what people see, and a lot of times they end up caring more about that than anything, which is a whole other story because they should care about everything. But yeah. Yeah, I think the main problem we definitely ran into, though, was like not using the Trojan horse method at first. It was basically like, we're going to try to sell this as this awesome new thing, and we were stupid, and they were basically like, nope, we're not going to do that. So we were like, here's what we'll do instead, which is a lot better. Yeah, thanks. I know that was pretty quick. Hopefully it's, about 7? Does anybody have any questions about component libraries? Okay.
So you guys are using this on 2 brands. Could this easily be expanded out to like 5 or 6 brands?
Yeah, so we're actually looking into, not us as developers, our company is looking into doing a basically white label solution. So we sell online suits and tuxedo rentals, but then there's your old mom and pop Gino somewhere that sells suits. And we're like, well, we want to supply them with our suits and like give them like a website. So we're looking at white labeling our site. And the problem is it would need to be different for everybody. So what we can do is we can ship this, and then we can dynamically load in a different variables file for them. So we could give them an admin where they can go through and change all the variables in that file. So they can change the drop shadow levels, the font sizes, all of that. So theoretically, it could expand infinitely. So that was one reason that we did it, is we saw in the future, it's like, we're going to have to potentially like have a bunch of different white label sites that all look different, and we're not going to have them call us and say like, we want our buttons different or spin up a new Bootstrap theme. So that was one reason we decided to like push hard on the component library, which was a good selling point for us. So any more questions? I thought I saw somebody else. Yeah.
So so this is my first exposure to React. So
Okay.
this might be a stupid question.
No.
But are you able to put into a component library functionalities? Or is it primarily
Yeah. So let me find a good example here. So in our component library right here, I don't know if we have any that have great functionality, but like one of them is like our reviews widget, and it basically like we put in all of this data, it filters it out. We call the things with functionality like composed, if that makes sense. So they're more full-fledged components, but we stick in reviews. It handles all of this. We could put in logic here that if it says click on a button, send that back up the chain of the component and back out to where you call it. So you can absolutely add functionality into those things. And I think that's where it gets powerful. We started with small components, and we've been slowly building out bigger things. But we're even looking at componentizing like sign up in our nav bar. So our nav bar, you can hover over it and see all of your events drop down. So you can absolutely add logic and all of that to this, which is a lot of fun. You can see that in button a little bit where you can pass on click to it, and when it's clicked, it'll send you that back. But normally a component won't, it's not going to make an API request for you. It's not going to fetch its own data. Normally how you want to do it is you give it data and you give it callbacks basically for saying when these things happen, let me know, and here's the data you consume. So how I implement this reviews widget on our site is it's basically like, here's all the reviews. If you scroll down and click the load more button, it tells me they clicked the load more button, and I have what page we're on, what review count we're on, and I will send it then more reviews at that point. So it kind of handles the abstract logic, but not the fine details of let me make an API request. And the reason we didn't want to add anything like that to it, though, like API requests, is this could be on. We've got a lot more than our 2 brands. We also have like a customer support app that like our customer support agents use, a warehouse app. But you could have specific scenarios if you know that you only have one site, but you want to say like have a component that pulls in like a Twitter feed. Like there's no reason that, for example, couldn't reach out to Twitter if you wanted. It's such a specific use case that it's like the only thing this can be used for is pulling in a Twitter feed. Does that answer it? Probably the long way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Sweet.
So,
Chris, how do you know if you just go to DevTools or inspect, how do you know if something is built in this?
Oh, yeah, so you can see if something is building correctly just from your terminal right here. So I know it's all the way at the bottom. I don't have any big red flashing errors that are telling me your thing failed to build. Does that make sense?
No, how would I know that that's a component construction?
What do you mean?
What versus any other kind of build?
So how can you, I think what he's saying is how can you tell that it's a React component
Yeah,
versus like just a regular HTML button in your DevTools?
Oh, yeah.
Because I know Chrome has the special React extension that you're using Firefox.
Firefox has the same extension. It also technically doesn't matter. So when you're inspecting, it doesn't really matter if it's a React button or a normal button. React is just outputting a button. Same thing with Vue and Angular. They don't output some sort of like special Angular button. They just output a button. But I do have the React DevTools.
I didn't know. So they're an extension to
Yeah, so I can come over here and click on the React DevTools. And I will admit they're kind of slow sometimes in Firefox.
Do you prefer Firefox over Chrome for any like specific reason?
I think Chrome's been kind of buggy recently, and I've used Firefox for a long time, but that's just because I'm trying to get off the Google train. Same reason I use DuckDuckGo and everything else. Yeah, so you can see over here in the React DevTools that it's rendering story, and you can see all my buttons are right here, and I can see the props that were passed into them. If you can see those, default, false. I can click on this next button and see info was passed into it. I can see it's children. So that's how you can really dive deep into like your React stuff. And I'm guessing if anybody here knows Angular, Vue, they have stuff like that as well. But the great thing about Storybook, I think, the great thing about component libraries is it's more of an abstract concept. You can build it in whatever language you want. And I really like Storybook and chose it for this because Storybook supports everything. So not just React, basically, because you can pass it a custom Webpack file if you want your components. You can do whatever. I know somebody else back. Yeah.
So are there any other alternatives to Storybook? You mentioned that you liked Storybook, but are there anything else similar?
So I have not looked into it to know if there's a lot different. What we were doing before Storybook came out is basically you would build it and build your components inside the component library, and it would just build those and export them. That way you could import them in other projects. So we would build our components, and if you've ever used npm link, you basically like have your package and you would type npm link, then you would go into the project you're using the components, and you would type npm link. For us it's at Generation Tux /component library, and that would basically link your local components that you were building with Webpack to the project you were working in, and then you would use them locally in there. So a good example of like how we use them is, I think I have, serious stuff. So I have a playground here that I think is just a create React app. Yeah, so you can see right here at the beginning, this is what you would do. So how we use our components is we host them on NPM, and you can see we basically just say import whatever components we're using from @Generation Tux /component library. And we would link it with a local library and then just develop in either like a React playground or actually in our project. The problem is when you link it, you have to wait for your components to build, then you have to wait for that other project to recognize they've built, and then it'll rebuild. So on some of our big projects, it can take, 15 to 20 seconds for that to happen. And it was super slow. So every time you hit save and wanted to see what was going on, add 30 seconds. I don't know if there's any alternatives that try to compete with Storybook. Storybook is fairly new, or it's just gotten popular fairly recently. But I don't know of any alternatives. But it's a really good one. I can't think of any reason that I would be looking for an alternative at the moment, especially because it doesn't impact how my components are actually built. So like I can drop Storybook right now if I wanted to, and my components build just fine. Because that all happens through, if we come back to...
That's not mainly about like documentation.
Okay.
Instead of manually writing or like, creating component showcase.
Yeah. So before we used Storybook, we would just start a new markdown file that was like button.md and document our components that way. There'll never be something that's totally self-documenting, where you just point at your component and it knows exactly what's going on. So we found that Storybook, where you can basically just write examples using the component, was the easiest way to document it. So because before that it was a much, much harder process, which is fun to use Storybook. Does that answer the question? Okay, sweet. But yeah, so that's, speaking of how we publish our component library, we publish it as a private NPM package. I don't know why it's private at the moment, but we did it for a minute, and we need to unprivate it. It doesn't need to be. But we publish it as an NPM package, and then where we want to use it, we just install it. So if you come to the React playground that I was on here, you'll see our component library is just installed here. So when we want to update it, we'll just go into whatever project we want to update it, npm install the component library, and then push that out to production. But our component library lives on npm for us. And then we're working on a little tool now that will basically, every time we update our component library, go to every repo that it's updated in and automatically make a PR. So if we update the component library, it'll go to the Generation Tux UI website and automatically make a PR that has the update for that. That's what we're working on now, because it is kind of slow to go through and update, especially because it's used in 4 places now, to update each of those every time you update it. That's fun. Anybody else have questions?
Who supports Storybook?
Who supports Storybook? So there is a guy. I saw a tweet the other day.
It's a guy.
It is a guy, yes.
One guy.
Huh?
One guy.
Smart guy.
Random guy in the basement.
So Storybook, right here. Probably a random guy in the basement. No, but so they got enough basically reoccurring funding for him to quit his job and support Storybook full time. So my guess is that here are the backers for Storybook. Sponsors, Airbnb, all of that, whatever these other ones are. Is that Beats? What is that? And then those are the backers.
Did they keep up with it pretty well?
Yes, they do. So they just came out with, I'm looking for like their maintainers. Honestly, we can probably just look at insights and look at contributors, and it's probably the top guy. Besides dev dependency bots, but they keep up with it very well. So I think they just came out with version 20. Version 4. I don't know where I got 20. It must have been something else. But yes, they keep up with it very, very well. But the cool thing is that Storybook it's not crucial to my component library. So it's not like if Storybook stops working tomorrow, my components stop working. What's crucial to my components is React and styled components. If those were to stop working tomorrow for some reason, stop maintaining them, we'd have a problem. But if they stop maintaining React tomorrow, we have a very big problem. Everybody does. So that's one of those things I don't worry about because there's much bigger fish to fry if that happens. And then Styled Components is maintained by PayPal. So I'm normally a fan of stuff that's maintained or has a backer for a bigger company. I know it stinks because the bigger company is the one that gets what they want, but I can also have a bit of confidence that hopefully it will be there tomorrow, unless it's by Google. And then you have no guarantee it'll be there tomorrow. Right. Little Google bash there. But yeah, so Storybook it's definitely got some good backers, which is fun. But yeah, I think if we scroll down here, there's some great examples, supported frameworks, React Native, Vue, Angular, Polymer, and apparently just plain old HTML now. So, and whatever the rest of those are. And then you can see here all of the official add-ons, and you can browse other add-ons. So they've got like the ally add-ons, which basically say like, is like what you're writing accessible? Like, does your alt tag for an image just contain the word image? You can include that directly in Storybook, and it will basically say, whoa, this is no good. This is not like accessible stuff that you're writing. Yeah. Any more questions? Yeah.
Just a point of clarification more than anything. You're essentially using Storybook to streamline the process of creating your component library.
Exactly.
And you're kind of in state. I know you described your whole Trojan horse scenario. You're trying to eliminate the need for Bootstrap altogether with these components?
Yes, exactly. So Storybook is just documentation and lets us iterate a bit faster. It's just got some nice tools. And then our end goal is we want to eliminate Bootstrap. So Bootstrap is great, but we're finding like we're at version 3 now, still not version 4, and we've got a bunch of custom styling on top of it to the point where we're like only using half of Bootstrap, and it's kind of just like a mess, and it's not like consistent everywhere. While with the component library, our hope is that like if we need to upgrade our column and row system, where hopefully in the next year we'll be able to upgrade to CSS Grid instead of Flex, we can just ship that in our component library. We just bump one version number, and we know exactly what things are affected. Just same way if we update a button, we know that only the button is affected, not that we updated the class block, but we didn't realize that that was also being extended from buttons. That's our hope with it. We really never know until, 2 years down the road, come and ask me again, ask if component libraries was the best idea ever. There's things like that all the time. Everybody's like, I've got the best idea, which is why I want to be very clear that like this, I think is good for us in our situation, but I'm definitely not going to be the guy that's like walking in somewhere and like, you're not using component libraries, you're wrong. Because it's really just about like, how can we get work done best as a team for our company? But yeah, that's our hope with the component library. I think it'll be 2 years when all of us are gone and there's new developers in there that had to inherit all of our stuff. That'll be the real test to see whether it worked well. Any question? Any more? Yeah.
So going back to Styled Components,
yeah.
How do you convince an old school dev that they want to go to Styled Components instead of just dropping class name everywhere?
Yeah. So write a better first half of my talk, I guess. So that's a problem we have, is we have designers that 2 years ago there was no front-end developers. It was basically back-end developers and designers did most of the front-end development work. Now we've got me and another guy, Brandon Stevens, if you know him, he's awesome. We're basically like the front-end developers at Generation Tux. But we've still got designers who sometimes we're at 100% capacity and like stuff that has to get done, they jump in on things. And it's been difficult to convince them because they're in that group that's like, why are we changing this? This is complicated. Why can't we just use plain CSS?
Like Styled Components not being the thing in like 2 years.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times we show them the benefits of it. We show them, here's how easy it is to use. You can still write CSS. You're already writing Sass, so you're already not using pure CSS. And then a lot of times I think that like people who are in that camp, like especially so far it's been that like they're like weary of like CSS and JavaScript is because it's new and they're afraid of not knowing it, if that makes sense. So we've tried to make it really easy for the guys who are kind of timid about writing CSS and JavaScript to get in, start writing things, get them involved early, if that makes sense, so they have a say. But yeah, you'll never totally convince someone who's pure CSS to use styled components unless they try it out and they love it. Because at first there are some things that are confusing. You think like, how's all my stuff gonna inherit? Like, I can't just write one thing and everything inherits it. Or like, how do I add styling to the body? Like, how do I add global styling like that to the body? And you have to give them examples, and here's how you do that. So another big part of it is basically just saying you can still do everything you were doing. It just operates in a different way. And then there is quite a bit of JavaScript involved too. So you definitely, like, if you have someone who just knows CSS, they'll have to learn some JavaScript. Because you can see, like, in our example, we wrote a list or an object that had different things in it and injected that in. You've got to know JavaScript to do that. So it does add a little bit of a barrier there for those guys. But I wish I had a better answer. If you find one, let me know. Yeah.
Do you have an example of the context API, like where you're talking about?
Yeah. Let me pull one up. Where's a good example of one? Actually, I think the playground probably has an example. So we can write a little example here. So you can see. So we've got our theme right here. So I'm just gonna make a button. Hey. So here's theme that wraps those things. And then I'm going to write a button here for Mingwen and just leave that as hey. Let me spin this up. Cross our fingers, hope that it works. That's a bad example because those look similar. We'll change button type equals info. So you can see here, you've got 2 different colored buttons, 2 different fonts, 2 different everything. And how it's working, you've got a theme component that accepts brand, and it's wrapped those. This doesn't have to be here. So this can be way up. This can be 100 components up. So if we look at like our shared ecom package, so if I go, let's find out where theme is used. So we use themes in our routes file right here. It's at the very top, and this is a single page app. And I mean, there are buttons that are nested 20 components deep, and it will inherit from those. Theme is fairly simple to use. You'll have to read the context API to understand it. It's a bit more, I think, than I could explain here. But this is the basics of how we've implemented it. We just wrote a nice wrapper component around it, and basically lets us set our theme. And then you can see at the top of this other one, we do window.organization. That's our nice hacky way of doing it now. So no matter where we load this single page app in on, it'll pull in the organization. So it'll pull in Gentux, Mingwen, third party B, but it basically lets us extend that. In the future, how this theme component would work is that right now, it's got all the variables files live in the component library. Eventually, what will have to happen if we do decide to go the white label route is you'll have to inject your theme file with this. So you'll basically have to say, here are all of my variables, I'm injecting it, just basically saying like instead of brand, it's variables, and you pass in your object of whatever variables. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's how that works. It was awesome for us to figure out, like, React Context was announced, like, because it always had that little warning label under React, if everybody knows it. You would go look up the context API, and for the past 2 years, it's been like, this might change, don't use this. And in React 16.2 or whatever, they said, you can use it, here it is, it's better. And that opened up the door for us to basically say, we can finally do some of this theming stuff now, in a nice way. Because all of these components have access to context. And then inside the component library, you have to write stuff a bit different to allow them access, but they've got tools for all of that. It's all built in. And Styled Components has a lot of awesome stuff in their documentation. So you can look at under theming right here is where you would see that. There's media queries, animations, a lot of cool stuff. So you can import keyframes. Because we do have we've got our one animated, our spinner. So we've got our animated thing. So we've done tiny bit with the animation stuff in Styled Components, and we've been very happy with how easy it's been to work with. to the point where we're very happy because it's so close to CSS. Like the thing before that held us back from CSS and JavaScript was like doing the styled blocks, because before in JavaScript, if you wanted to write CSS, you would have to say like style equals this, and then you'd do like background color is red, and then the padding bottom is 20 pixels, and you had to know it's like, well, everything is camel cased, and you have to wrap these in strings. It just wasn't super intuitive. And then this is like, how do I add animations in here? And as far as I know, the answer is you don't. How do you add media queries in that? You don't. It's just inline styling. And then we weren't super happy with the, if you've seen the Create React app way, where you just have like a style.css file and Webpack bundles that together for you. We found that it really wasn't solving the problem of, we want to be able to edit our CSS with confidence that it will only affect certain things. Yeah, I know that probably over-answered the question.
Can you pull up your site?
Oh yeah.
Plug it for yourself?
Yeah, we can pull it up. So GenerationTux.com, this is the old non-single page app. Where we've started to work with the component library is here. So everything that you're seeing is actually built with the component library, which has been a lot of fun. I'm going to make a test account, and I'm sure somebody's going to get mad at me. So everything has been built with the component library. So you can do like pretty complex things with components. And what you see in that components documentation there, we maybe have 16 components. And you can build pretty much about anything with just a few small components. If you're looking for a component library that's a good one to look at just for like examples, no, I don't want that. Pinterest has a great component library called Gestalt, I think. And they do not use Storybook, but they've got great documentation for their component library, and we copied their box. Box is super important for a component library. You basically need like a general component that can do a lot, if that makes sense. So you can see all of the features that theirs has here. And we have a lot of these features. They have margin top, start, padding, X, Y, all of that fun stuff gets into Box. Box was definitely the hardest one to build, but it's core for all of our other components. So like column and row just extend Box. All of our composed components, so like reviews and then star rating, stuff like that, when we only have 2 composed components at the moment, these are all actually built using components in the component library. So like these are all just built using Box. So everything that you see here is actually built with Box and title and all of that, which is fun. Headers, another great one to put in a component library. We just kind of started out with the ones that were becoming pain points for us and just started there. And headers were definitely a pain. We have all of our icons in the component library, which has been a great place because we'll run into problems where design will make a new icon, and we're like, great. Now we don't know where those are used. How are we going to swap that out? Like basically a big pain in the butt. So these are all just SVG icons that are in React components, and we've really liked that. Image has been a great component for us. We use something called Imgex, I think is what it is. And it's basically a CDN that allows us to pass up the size of the image we want, the compression ratio. So there's an image component in here where you basically, if you've used source set in HTML at all, you can basically say like, the browser will automatically detect, like if they're on 3G, and you can say, if you're on a slower network, load in this image. If you're on a faster network, load in this one. And with this component, using our ImageX URLs, you basically pass it a single image URL, and it will automatically set different sizes and compression ratios for those images. That way mobile sites load in smaller images. So they'll be maybe blurry, but if someone's on a 3G connection, you want to get them on your site as fast as possible. So it'll pull in a smaller image. The problem is that was super hard. Like I wasn't even going to sit around and write that for all of our images. But now I have a component that does all that for me. And that's maybe actually probably our second most complex component. Just simple stuff, line. Picture does the same thing. If you use picture in HTML, it's a great simple way to write picture. One problem we ran into 2 brands is sometimes you just need to write different HTML for both brands. Like you can have a component library that switches, but you just can't avoid it. So we were like, well, how can we handle this in like small scenarios? We're still working on how to handle it where it's like the whole page needs to be totally different. But in small scenarios where it's like we want we've got a primary button for Gentux and Mingwen, but on Mingwen we need it to be the info button, not the primary button. So we built a little component called case. And basically you pass in, it's a case component, and I actually don't have the info on here, but it's literally just case, and you say the brand is Gentux. And if the brand is Gentux, it'll render what's inside of that. If it's Mingwen, it'll render what's inside of that. They're always gotchas, where they're like, we need this to be absolutely different on the other brand for some reason, but that's just how it's going to go. And I think if you work in web development, it's probably pretty rare to have a company that only has one site, one platform, one anything. Like it's hard not to, even if it's just internal tools. Yeah, any more questions?
So this component library could be used with React Native too, if you've ever done that?
I don't think so. So I've used React Native a bit. This component library, well, no, React Native uses different, like, it doesn't use like divs and all of that. But the concept, from what I understand, Styled Components works with React Native, and then Storybook works with React Native. So you can use the same tools, but I doubt you can use the same component library. You might be able to bundle the React Native stuff in here if you wanted. But I'm normally weary of saying yes when people ask if it's like, will this thing work in React Native? Like, can we share code? We don't have to like duplicate code. Because I found that normally not. But the same tools would work, so you would be working in a similar environment. But you probably wouldn't be able to reuse the code. Yeah, that's a good question. Any more? Please.
Nice job.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. If you have more questions, let me know. I'll post this in the Louisville Slack channel or something, a link to the GitHub page. Something that might be interesting to look at is how I use Webpack to actually build everything. So I didn't show you how I use Webpack to build the individual components, just how I use Storybook, but there's documentation for how to do that in there, if you want an example. And then I put it on Netlify so you can see Storybook on Netlify. But thank you. Thanks for coming. So I appreciate it.